Good afternoon. We are in Mystetskyi Arsenal, one of the biggest Ukrainian places for art and for book publishers and book audience. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher and writer, chief editor of ukraineworld.org, website in English about Ukraine. And today I will talk with you about the problem of propaganda, information warfare, malign information influences, and the way how Ukrainian book environment and book publishing, it's interesting to look at the way how Ukraine is trying to fight against this disinformation. Because the point is that Ukraine is on the front line of this fight against Kremlin disinformation since at least 2014, but I would say quite early, as from the beginnings of Ukrainian independence, or from the beginnings of the 20th century, or from the beginnings of the 19th century, and you can go deeper and deeper in history. And it is, if we talk about the current time, it is interesting how Ukrainian civil society has developed an ecosystem of different fact-checking organizations. We can mention Stop Fake, we can mention Beyond the News, we can mention VoxCheck, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, Internews Ukraine, and many other projects, many other NGOs. This is a daily work of fact-checking, work with the citizens, work to debunk the myths of Kremlin propaganda, etc. But it is also interesting to look at the Ukrainian book production, because one of the key responses, possible responses to disinformation and to malign information influences, is actually to go to real stories of people, real stories of cities, of communities, and tell these stories. And Ukrainian writers, Ukrainian authors are actually doing this job. There are quite a booming process of reportage. There are several prizes for reportage journalists. There are several websites who are basically developing this genre of reportage. So today I'm going to talk to you not so much about this fact-checking work, which is very important, but about this genre of documentary books, or the storytelling books, or the books about certain experience, individual experience, community experience, and journalistic experience in their reportage. And let me start with the issue, with the rubric, with the chapter that I would call New Dissidents. New Dissidents is I can quote my friend Michel Yelchaninov, a French philosopher who was one of those who launched this initiative in France. But it was very dear for us Ukrainians, because it was launched, as far as I remember, when one of the major political prisoners, Ukrainian political prisoners, Oleg Sentsov, was imprisoned in Russia. And there are still hundreds of prisoners, Ukrainian political prisoners, in Russian jails, or in the jails of the occupied territories in Donbas and Crimea. There are also, I can refer to the websites, for example, Prisoner's Voice, or the websites Let My People Go, that provide this information about these prisoners. But it is important also to look at the experience of some of these prisoners who came back to Ukraine, who are hopefully saved alive. And I would like to mention two books which are very important in this subject. One of the books is by Oleg Sentsov, one of the most prominent Ukrainian political prisoner, who spent many years in Russian prison, and who launched a hunger strike, which he kept for very long period of time, for I think 170 something days. And there is a book, there is his testimony of this. This book is available both in Russian and Ukrainian, so you can translate it from the language that you prefer. And it is called Хроніка одного голодування, the timeline of one hunger strike. So this book is a very simple diary of Oleg Sentsov, who is describing his experience of hunger strike, which took huge amount of time. And you know, if you know Oleg Sentsov, you can see that he's trying to be very fact-focused and very non-emotional. So this is a book written very simply in a very human language, and it is a book of a very strong personality who describes what's going on and the situation in prison and how he rejects all the calls, to stop the hunger strike, and how he communicates with the prison management, etc. So this is a really very important book, and why we can call it New Dissidents, because we can actually understand that, all these horrible horrors of Gulag and, Siberia camps and Mordovia camps and all this stuff, which we are accustomed to by reading, for example, the memoirs of the Soviet dissidents. All these horrors are still there. So we can talk about the authoritarian regime Russian authoritarian regime who is continuing these practices. The second book, which I would like to talk to you about, is a book by Stanislav Aseev, which is called A Path of Light, Світлий шлях, A History of One Concentration Camp. And I would say that this is, in terms of, emotion, this is one of the most horrifying books that I have read over the past time, because what Stanislav Aseev is describing, he was a prisoner in Izolyatia in Donetsk. Izolyatia is an art space. Before the war, it was an art space, and during the war, after 2014, it was turned into a real concentration camp, into a real camp, real prison, illegal prison, where people are kept without any trials, without any legal foundations, and are being tortured. And all these tortures are very concretely and in detail described in this book. And therefore, I'm saying that this is a horrifying book for our humanity, to understand that here in the middle of Europe, in Donetsk, the great, beautiful city, which hosted 2012 football championship, the Euro 2012, and just even less than a decade ago, and now this is a city where the most horrifying tortures are being made to humans. So I think this is a must-read book for international audiences, for those who want really to know from the first hand, from the first eyes, what is going on there, what is going on in these occupied territories, occupied by pro-Russian forces with the help of the Russian army. And it is important also in the context of propaganda, because Russian propaganda is always using and abusing this topic of, concentration camps, like saying that European Union came to Ukraine and established concentration camps. These was the messages before the war, preparing the citizens that, well, the Western powers are in reincarnation of Nazism and fascism that are coming to Eastern Europe to impose their concentration camps. Or they're talking about genocide. They're talking about, Ukrainian authorities who are, imposing genocide over its citizens. All these blunt fakes, blunt disinformation, all those lies are basically, the aim is to mask the real process which is going on there in Donetsk, the real concentration camp that they have built, and we have witnessed who spent almost 2 years, or over the 2 years in this place, and who describe this story. And again, this is for today's understanding of human rights situation in the world. This is one of the most important books to read. And it is important to know that these books by Sentsov and Aseev have been already translated to several European languages, into English, into French, into German. So this shows also the attention that is paid to these books, and it is a product, the texts are already known in Europe, so you can check in your languages or languages that you can read. Now, I've talked to you about the new dissidents, but it's also important to talk about the old dissidents and Ukrainian dissident movement, which is in the Soviet Union, which I think it's quite underestimated in the European and the global context, because the global context knows quite well the Soviet dissidents, the Russian dissidents, but it seems to me that the Ukrainian experience is much less visible. And it is important to know about this experience to understand what is going on right now. Why? Because, for example, in the Ukrainian context, Ukrainian dissidents of the 1970s, 1980s, for example, they can show how Ukrainian national movement was embracing these liberal values of human rights, for example. Therefore, this establishment of Ukrainian Helsinki groups, Helsinki group meaning after Helsinki Final Act, after the idea that Soviet Union has signed the Helsinki Final Act and subscribed to these human rights values. So there were these dissident groups that were arguing that Soviet Union subscribed to them, but is remaining in authoritarian dictatorship which violates human rights. And it is important to look now about these people who were in these Helsinki groups, because either they are writing their own memoirs, or there are young Ukrainian journalists who are writing their stories and the way how they were persecuted. And it is important to look into these books to understand this story. Now, I would like to advise you one book about Levko Lukyanenko, which was also one of the prominent Ukrainian dissidents and basically also persecuted by the regime. So this is a very interesting book by Vera Kuriko, a young Ukrainian journalist, who wrote about what happened with Levko Lukyanenko in the 70s, when he was brought from the camps to Chernihiv, but he was constantly persecuted, he was constantly followed, and the whole bunch of people around him, people in his, in his building where he was living, in his residence building. So people in his, for example, in the work that in the workplaces that he has been working, or his wife has been working, were following him, were basically or constantly contacting with the KGB to tell the stories how Lukyanenko is behaving, what he is saying, and what anti-Soviet things he is basically expressing. So the book by Vera Kuriko, which is called Вулиця Причетних, A Street of Those Involved, this is a book about Levko Lukyanenko, one of the prominent Ukrainian dissidents. But also look at the memoirs of some of the dissidents. For example, Miroslav Marinovich and his book Universe Behind the Barbed Wire. Miroslav Marinovich is still very important Ukrainian public intellectual, and this book also, I think it will be very interesting to translate this book into your languages to give you the impression of the Soviet camps and Soviet relations with the dissidents. Also a book of conversation by Josef Zisels, one of the prominent Ukrainian dissident and one of the prominent Ukrainian Jewish public intellectuals, with Polish journalist Izabela Chruslinska. A book of conversation, but in which Zisels is telling lots of interesting stories, both about the persecution of dissidents in the Soviet Union, but also about the way how interesting it was in the Soviet camps when representatives of different nationalities were talking to each other. For example, when Jews and Jewish dissidents were talking, for example, to Ukrainian nationalists from the Ukrainian Insurrection Army, and how these nationalists, Ukrainian nationalists, and the Jewish dissidents were basically fighting against the same enemy and were even friends among each others. I think this is a place, so the Soviet gulags were also a place where this dialogue between the Jewish intelligentsia and Ukrainian intelligentsia was quite an interesting case of this intercultural communication. Now let's move further, and I would like to talk to you about the next chapter, which I would call Maidan, Crimea, Donbas. And here, of course, you have lots of stories, fake stories, manipulation stories by Kremlin propaganda about the fact which is calling Maidan a coup d'etat, which is calling the the government, post-Maidan government, a junta government, etc. Now we have, of course, since 2014, several books which were telling the story of Maidan from the, from the eyewitnesses, and by reading these books, you can follow these stories. One of the books is quite recent. This is a book of Mikhailo Vinnytsky, a Canadian, Ukrainian sociologist and also public intellectual, which is called Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War. This book is initially published in English, and it is published for international audiences. It is published in Germany by Ibidem Verlag. It's now translated into Ukrainian, but you can take the English original because Vinnytsky is a native speaker in English, and also see how interesting it can be for your context. You can even translate it from English if, for example, you are not really practicing translations from Ukrainian. Why this book is interesting? Because it has two parts. It has a kind of a chronicle, empirical part, a timeline of events, where Mikhailo is telling the events how they were developing day by day, week by week, month by month. And it's very important to, even for those people who lived through Maidan, to kind of recollect, to remind ourselves about what was going on. It's also important for young people who were probably kids at that time to read this story. And of course, it's important for historians, for journalists, for analysts to also to read this story in a kind of a very ordered timeline. But the other part of the book, it's the analysis, and the analysis provides you basically with different ideas, different concepts, helping us to understand both Maidan, the Ukrainian revolutionary process, because we can talk about other uprisings, other revolutions as well, and Vinnytsky is talking about this as well, but also the war, the causes of the war, and basically it is showing why the Donbas conflict is not a civil war inside Ukraine, because they're providing proofs how Russians and Kremlin was orchestrating it. Another important book is about Crimea, and it is a book by Natalia Gumenyuk, a prominent Ukrainian journalist, which is called Загублений острів, Lost Island, which is also already published, have been translated into German, so you can check the German translation. And this book is her reportage, her reports, journalist reports from occupied Crimea. She went there many times since the occupation. She was one of the rare Ukrainian journalists to go to occupied Crimea. And this is very lively, humane stories. Again, against any propaganda, against any manipulations, it's telling you the real stories of people. Another interesting book is a book about Donbas. And this is a book written by Ukrainian writer and art curator Alexander Michet, which is called «Я змішаю твою кров з вугіллям». To translate, we can translate like «I will mess up your blood with coal», understanding Ukrainian East. So Michet is somebody who spent some time in the government-controlled territories on Donbas. So we're talking about the post-war period, and he was doing interesting art projects in Donbas. And in parallel, he was writing his book, which is kind of a mixture of reports, interviews, essays, and maybe kind of a mixture of nonfiction and this essayist approach. And it kind of gives you probably contemporary picture of current Donbas, what is going on right now, but also with linkages with stories from the past to understand the heritage of it and the reasons for, the deep reasons, historical reasons for what is now going on in this part of Ukraine. There are several books that I want to mention about the specific topics of fight against disinformation and Ukrainian experience of it, and maybe not even only Ukrainian experiences of it. One of these books is called Revision of History, Russian Historical Propaganda and Ukraine, which is published by my organization, Internews Ukraine. It analyzes the key historical myths about Ukraine spread by Kremlin propaganda and the way how Ukrainian historians are trying to analyze it and respond to it. This book is available in English and Ukrainian, so if you're interested in it, you can check it in English too. Another interesting book is a book by Oksana Moroz, which is called Natia Ovochyv, the Nation of Vegetables. The vegetable is, of course, a metaphor. But this book is written by a person who was involved, as she says, involved very much into, this information flows and information wars inside Ukraine by Ukrainian politicians, businessmen, etc. So Oksana is telling the story from within, from inside Ukraine, how it all works, how this information warfare, political information and disinformation warfare is working. Another interesting book is basically a already classical book by a person who is not Ukrainian but who was born in Kiev, Peter Pomerantsev, and his book This Is Not Propaganda, which is already translated in many languages, so you can actually check it in many other languages. It is very interesting in terms of, he also talks about Ukrainian cases, he talks about Soviet cases, he compared what is going on right now with the Soviet propaganda machine, but it is a very good analytical tool to understand what is going on right now. Another chapter which I would like to talk to you is, I would call it Ukraine as it is. So there are many reportage books, documentary books, which are trying to show Ukrainian life or life of Ukrainian citizens without any cliches, without any narratives behind them, without any propaganda, cliches, etc. One of these books is a book by Olesy Yeremchuk, which is called Nashi Inshi, Ours, Others. You can translate it like that. Stories of Ukrainian diversity. It's a book about Ukrainian diversity, about ethnical diversity. So each of the essays of the books, each of the reportages is talking about a specific people in specific national minority. Olesy is telling about Ukrainian Swedes, Ukrainian Roma, Ukrainian Jews, Ukrainian Greeks, Ukrainian Turks, Ukrainian Germans, Ukrainian Czechs, etc. And it's really showing Ukraine as a very multinational and diverse country. Another book, it is written by Ukrainian journalist Pavlo Stech, and it is called Over the Abyss in Rust, Над прірвою віржі. Actually, there is a play of words in the title, but I would not concentrate on it. Basically, it is a book of reports about Elektrichka. Elektrichka is a Ukrainian electric train, but contrary to what it might sound, electric train, probably something futurist, something very modern, very technological. Ukrainian Elektrichka is basically very old-fashioned type of transportation and very cheap, and therefore a place where the poorest people are traveling. And this journalist Pavlo Stech has traveled a lot in this Elektrichka and talking to very simple people, often quite poor people. So this gives you, an insight in probably one can call it real Ukraine, one could call it poor Ukraine, but from the social point of view, it's a very interesting experience. And the classics of Ukrainian reportage, like right now, is a book by a project Ukrainer, which is one of the famous Ukrainian reportage and traveling project launched by Bogdan Logvinenko. The book is called Ukrainer, Країна зсередини, A Country Inside. So if you want to dig into the different stories of Ukrainian cultural and humane diversity, this is a book for you. It's also available in English. And the final chapter, I would call it Understanding Ukraine. And here I would advise you several books which will tell you Ukrainian story not from the journalistic or empirical point of view, but rather from the point of view of historians, writers, and this would be a point of view of not facts, not stories, but senses. And here I would like to focus on three books. One is republished historical essays by Ivan Lysiak-Rudnitsky, which is one of the biggest Ukrainian historians. These two-volume of his historical essays have been recently republished in Ukraine, and it is one of the biggest, one of the greatest entry points into Ukrainian history. And there are different essays, quite short essays, so you can just check some of them to understand the specifics of Ukrainian history, identity, mentality, and relations with other people, with other nations as well. Another book is a collection of essays, of selected essays by Oksana Zabushko, the classic of Ukrainian contemporary literature, which is called Planeta Polin, the planet Wormwood. And here, this is a collection of essays that most of them have been already published previously, but you can also see the essays which give lots of senses, lots of, I would say, intellectual background for Ukrainian debates right now. One of the topics which I would mention is the debate of colonialism and post-colonialism, trying to understand Ukraine in the terms of, post-colonialism. So it's a very important book to read and understand. And the last book I would like to mention is a book by Ukrainian historian Kyrylo Galushko, which is called Ukrainian Nationalism, A Lesson for Russians. This is kind of an ironical title. The book is written by Ukrainian historian in Russian, and it is addressing the key historical myths which Kremlin propaganda is spreading about Ukraine, about all Ukrainian history, medieval history, modern history, the Ukrainian language, ethnonyms, etc. Because one of the key message of Russian propaganda is Ukraine is not a real country; it's just a version of Russia. So the book is written for Russians, and in Russian, but I would say it's very interesting to read for all those who are perceiving Ukraine through the Russian eyes, Russian lenses, and through some Russian narratives which probably entered the discourse of schools and school teaching and university teaching in your country. This is it. This is the list of books which I would like to advise to you. And to sum up, Ukraine is a very interesting country in terms of, fight against disinformation, fight against propaganda from an authoritarian country, from a Kremlin, from Russian propaganda. I would say it's a kind of a front line, and it's interesting to study Ukrainian experience, both from the perspective of all those fact-checking initiatives which exist in Ukraine, but also from the perspective of those books which are published in Ukraine. Many of them, as you can see, are basically books of documentary literature, storytelling, and empirical journalism.